Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back into the softly uncomfortable world of the Middle Ages. So take a moment, lower the lights, let the room settle. When we imagine medieval food, we usually think of enormous roasted meats, golden bread, overflowing goblets, and cheerful peasants laughing around a fire. Naturally, this image was invented by people who did not live in the Middle Ages. Real medieval diets were less festive and far more beige. If you were not a noble, and most people were not, your meals were repetitive, filling, and aggressively practical. Flavor was optional, survival was the goal, pleasure was considered suspicious. The foundation of nearly every medieval diet was grain. Grain everywhere. Grain in forms that would make modern nutritionists sigh deeply and stare out of a window. Bread was the main event, the supporting act, and the encore. If you were poor, your bread was dark, dense, and made from whatever grain was cheapest that year. Rye, barley, oats, sometimes mixed together in a way that suggested desperation rather than a recipe. Wheat bread, white and soft, was reserved for the wealthy, because of course it was. Even bread had class anxiety. This bread was not the fluffy loaf you might be imagining. Medieval bread was heavy. It was often sour. It could crack a tooth if baked too hard, or dissolve into paste if baked too soft. Sometimes it was used as a plate. This was called a trencher. You would eat your meal off it, soaking it in grease and broth, and then either eat the bread afterward or give it to someone poorer than you, which was a very low bar to clear. The bread absorbed everything, including whatever bacteria happened to be present that day. Delicious in a historical sense. Alongside bread came pottage. Pottage was not a specific dish so much as a lifestyle choice. It was a thick stew made by boiling whatever was available in a pot for a very long time. Vegetables, grains, scraps of meat if you were lucky, herbs if you were pretending. The pot might be topped up day after day, meaning Tuesday's dinner still contained philosophical traces of Sunday's meal. This was efficient. It was economical. It was also deeply unsettling, but medieval people were not in a position to be picky. Vegetables were common, but not glamorous. Cabbage was everywhere. Turnips, onions, leeks, beans, peas, things that grew easily and complained very little. Fresh vegetables were seasonal, so most of the year you were dealing with dried, salted, or vaguely fermented versions. Salads existed, technically, but mostly among the wealthy, and even then they were often drenched in vinegar because medieval people believed raw vegetables were dangerous, which, given the sanitation, was not entirely wrong. Meat was a luxury for most. Peasants did not eat meat every day, despite the cheerful medieval illustrations suggesting otherwise. When they did eat meat, it was often small amounts, stretched thin or preserved in ways that made it chewy and aggressively salty. Pork was common because pigs would eat anything and complained less than cows. Beef required more resources, so it was less frequent. Chicken was valuable because it laid eggs, so eating it felt like killing tomorrow's breakfast. Naturally, people did it anyway. Fish was more common than meat, mostly because the church insisted on fasting days, and there were many fasting days. On these days, meat was forbidden, but fish was somehow fine, because medieval theology had a flexible relationship with logic. This led to some creative definitions of fish. Beavers were considered fish, so were certain birds if you argued convincingly enough. Eels were especially popular, slippery, strange, and abundant. They were eaten fresh, smoked, salted, and sometimes alive, which feels unnecessary. Dairy was present, but not in the form we know today. Milk spoiled quickly, so it was usually turned into cheese or butter. Medieval cheese ranged from soft and fresh to hard and aggressively aromatic. Some cheeses were aged, others were simply forgotten until they became a different substance entirely. Butter was used, but lard and animal fat were more common for cooking. Olive oil existed in the south. In the north, it was a rumor. Eggs were a staple when available, though again, religious rules complicated things. During Lent, eggs were forbidden. This did not stop chickens from laying them. The result was a brief post-Lent egg surplus that everyone pretended was a surprise every year. Medieval people were excellent at being shocked by predictable outcomes. Fruit existed, but mostly in season. Apples, pears, plums, berries. Fresh fruit was eaten cautiously because, once again, raw things were suspicious. Cooking fruit made it safer and, conveniently, mushier. Dried fruit was common among the wealthy and used in both sweet and savory dishes because medieval cuisine had not yet decided that flavors needed personal space. Now, for nobles and royals, the situation was different, but not necessarily better. They ate more, yes, they ate richer food, certainly, but variety came with its own problems. Noble diets were heavy in meat, bread, and alcohol. Vegetables were considered peasant food, which meant aristocrats avoided them enthusiastically. This led to predictable health issues. Gout was common, teeth were terrible, digestion was a daily adventure. Royal meals were structured, ceremonial, and deeply inefficient. Dozens of dishes might be presented, even though only a fraction would be eaten. Spices were used not to enhance flavor, but to demonstrate wealth. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were imported at great cost. Adding them to meat was a way of saying, "I can afford this," not "this tastes good." Sometimes the result was both impressive and confusing. Sugar deserves special mention. In the Middle Ages, sugar was a spice, not a sweetener. It was expensive and treated like medicine. The wealthy used it liberally, leading to severe dental problems that portraits politely ignore. Medieval royals often had blackened, decaying teeth hidden behind tight-lipped smiles. Naturally, no one mentioned this. Court etiquette frowned on honesty. Alcohol was safer than water. This is a myth. Water sources were often contaminated, especially in towns. Beer and ale were brewed weak, consumed daily, and given to children. This was normal. Wine was more common in southern regions and among the wealthy. Drunkenness existed, but mild intoxication was simply part of hydration. Medieval mornings were gentle and slightly buzzed.
Some children were crowned before they could read. Child kings were surrounded by regents who ruled in their name. These adults often disagreed violently about what was best for the child, the kingdom, or themselves. The child king became a symbol, wheeled out for ceremonies, dressed elaborately, and taught to nod at the right moments. Real power happened elsewhere. This environment produced adults who were emotionally stunted, deeply anxious, or explosively unstable. And this, in turn, produced more sickly, spoiled, and sad children. The cycle was elegant in its misery. Consider the lonely upbringing of children sent to foreign courts. They arrived not speaking the language, surrounded by strangers who had political reasons to be polite and personal reasons to be distant. Homesickness was not treated as a real condition. If a child cried, they were reminded of their duty. Duty was the medieval cure for everything. Punishment was common. Discipline was physical. Beatings were not unusual, even for royalty. The idea was to harden the child, to prepare them for rule. In practice, it taught fear. A fearful child becomes a fearful ruler. History noticed this pattern, but did not stop repeating it. Girls faced a quieter form of pressure. Their value lay in their future wombs. Health was monitored obsessively. A girl who seemed frail was a problem. A girl who was too strong was suspicious. Modesty was enforced early. Curiosity was discouraged. Silence was praised. These girls grew into women who were sent far from home, often never to return, to produce heirs in hostile courts. Childhood illnesses were rampant. Measles, smallpox, dysentery. Even minor infections could be fatal. Treatment involved prayers, relics, bleeding, and unpleasant potions. Recovery was uncertain. Death was accepted with practiced resignation. There was rarely time to grieve deeply before the political implications took over. And yet, despite all this, some children survived. Some even thrived in their own strange way. They learned to read people quickly. They learned caution. They learned that affection was temporary and power was not. These lessons shaped medieval rulers more than any formal education. So when we look at medieval kings and queens and wonder why they behaved the way they did, it helps to remember their beginnings, the cold rooms, the early separations, the constant scrutiny, the quiet understanding that they were valuable not because they were loved, but because they existed. As you rest now, safe in a world where childhood is at least supposed to be gentle, let these small, solemn figures drift past, crowned too early, tired before adulthood, carrying the weight of dynasties on narrow shoulders. And when you're ready, we'll drift onward again, toward marriages that should never have happened, but did anyway. If you're still with me, welcome back. If you drifted off somewhere among the sickly princes and solemn nurseries, that's perfectly appropriate. Tonight, we're easing forward into the next inevitable stage of medieval royal life, marriage. Not the romantic kind, not the hopeful kind, the kind arranged by tired men with maps, treaties, and absolutely no understanding of genetics. Settle in. Nothing moves quickly here, except the collapse of bloodlines. In the medieval world, marriage was not a personal milestone. It was a political transaction with vaguely human components. Royals married to secure borders, silence rivals, and keep property within the family. Ideally, very much within the family. If you could marry a cousin, why risk the unknown chaos of a stranger? Familial blood felt safer. Naturally, it wasn't. Children were promised to each other long before they understood what marriage meant. A prince might be betrothed in infancy to a girl he would not meet for a decade. Portraits were exchanged. These portraits were optimistic. Everyone agreed enthusiastically. The actual people involved were consulted rarely, if ever. Their job was to grow up and comply. When the wedding finally happened, often between adolescents, the expectations were immediate. Produce heirs, quickly, repeatedly. A successful royal marriage was almost entirely measured by how efficiently it generated children who survived long enough to be useful. Emotional compatibility was irrelevant. Personal happiness was a distraction. Consanguinity, the polite term for marrying relatives, was technically discouraged by the church. In practice, it was waved through with paperwork and a fee. Dispensations were common. If you were powerful enough, God was flexible. Cousins married cousins, second cousins married closer cousins, uncles married nieces, because medieval family trees were more like knots. At first, the effects were subtle. A slightly weaker child, a tendency toward illness, a temperament that leaned toward nervous or melancholic. Nothing alarming, nothing that couldn't be explained away with prayer or astrology. So the practice continued. Generation after generation, the gene pool narrowed quietly, like a hallway growing darker with each step. Royal couples often shared childhoods, tutors, and grandparents. They were deeply familiar and profoundly incompatible. Some marriages were cold and distant, others were actively hostile. A few managed polite indifference, which was considered a success. Infidelity was common, though discretion varied. Illegitimate children existed everywhere, carefully acknowledged or quietly ignored, depending on their usefulness. Spices and herbs were also used medicinally. Food and medicine overlapped in ways that modern people would find alarming. If you had indigestion, you ate something warm. If you were too warm, you ate something cold. Foods were categorized by humors: hot, cold, wet, dry. Balancing them was more important than taste. If your dinner was unpleasant but theoretically balanced your humors, it was considered a success. Famine was a constant threat. Bad harvests meant hunger, and hunger meant desperation. People ate grass,
roots, bark, and things that should not have been eaten by anyone with options. Grain shortages led to bread being stretched with whatever could be ground into flour, including beans, and, occasionally, regret. Chronic malnutrition was common, especially among the poor. Children ate what adults ate, only less of it. There were no special meals, no snacks, no treats, unless you count a piece of bread that wasn't actively stale. Childhood was short. Hunger was educational. So when we talk about medieval food, we are really talking about routine. The same meals, the same ingredients, the same compromises. Food was fuel. It was rarely exciting. Even for kings, eating was often more about display than enjoyment. And for everyone else, it was about getting through another day without starving. As you lie there now, comfortable and well-fed, possibly planning tomorrow's meals with unnecessary optimism, it's worth appreciating the luxury of choice. Medieval people did not browse menus. They ate what existed, and then they ate it again and again until history moved on or they didn't. Let's drift gently onward, carrying with us the faint scent of cabbage and stale bread toward the next quiet corner of medieval life, where things somehow become even less appetizing. If you're still awake, welcome back. If you're not, that's ideal. Tonight we're staying in the Middle Ages, but we're shrinking the scale slightly. We're lowering the crowns until they slide off small, fragile heads. We're talking about medieval royal childhoods, which, despite the silk blankets and gold embroidery, were often brief, uncomfortable, and medically disastrous. Try to imagine being born into unimaginable privilege and still not making it past your 5th birthday. History managed that trick quite often. Royal children were not raised the way modern parents might expect. Love, as we understand it now, was not the primary goal. Survival was, and lineage, mostly lineage. A royal child existed to continue a bloodline, secure an alliance, or become a bargaining chip in a future treaty. Emotional bonding was optional, frequently postponed, sometimes outsourced entirely to nurses, tutors, and distant relatives who would try not to get too attached, just in case. From the moment a royal baby was born, they were examined carefully for defects. This was not done gently. A healthy heir was a political asset. A sickly one was a potential disaster. Infant mortality was high for everyone, but royal children were under constant scrutiny because their deaths had consequences. If a baby survived its first few years, it was considered promising. Not loved, promising. Most royal children were handed over to wet nurses almost immediately. Breastfeeding was considered inappropriate for noble women, partly because it interfered with fertility, and partly because someone, somewhere, decided it wasn't dignified. The wet nurse became the closest thing to a mother many royal children ever knew. She fed them, soothed them, and sometimes stayed with them longer than their biological parents did. This arrangement ended abruptly when the child was old enough to be sent away. At around the age of 7, sometimes earlier, royal children were removed from their mothers entirely. Boys went to other courts or noble households to be trained. Girls were educated separately, often with an eye toward marriage. This separation was considered healthy. It taught discipline. It also taught emotional distance, which medieval royalty excelled at cultivating. Education for royal children was strict and relentless. Boys were taught languages, religion, warfare, and governance. Girls learned languages, religion, household management, and how to be agreeable while being traded across borders. Both were expected to behave like miniature adults. Play existed, but it was controlled and purposeful. Games were meant to build character. Character, in this case, meant obedience. Health was a constant concern, and medieval medicine did not help. Royal children were frequently bled to balance their humors. This was done regardless of whether they were ill.
Fertility problems were frequent, and blame almost always fell on the woman. If a queen failed to produce a healthy heir, she was scrutinized, isolated, and prayed over intensely. Her husband's genetic contribution was not discussed. This was medieval medicine at its finest. When children were born sickly or malformed, the mother was blamed again. Naturally, they kept marrying relatives. Some royal marriages produced children who were so frail they barely survived infancy. Others produced children who lived but suffered lifelong disabilities, speech impediments, mobility issues, cognitive difficulties. These were managed discreetly. The court adapted. Succession plans were adjusted. No one suggested changing the system. One of the more unfortunate outcomes of these marriages was the emergence of recognizable family traits, features that became exaggerated over time. The most famous, of course, is the Habsburg jaw, a pronounced lower jaw, thick lips, and an expression that suggested permanent confusion. It was distinctive. It was inherited. It grew more severe with each generation, like a genetic echo that refused to fade. Portraits tried to soften it. Artists were paid well to lie gently. Still, the jaw persisted, along with infertility, epilepsy, and early death. The family noticed. They commented on it privately, and then they married another cousin. Royal women bore the physical cost of this system most directly. Frequent pregnancies, miscarriages, stillbirths. Childbirth was dangerous under the best circumstances. In royal households, pressure made it worse. A queen who failed to produce an heir quickly risked disgrace or replacement. Some died young from complications. Others survived but were left weakened, exhausted, and emotionally hollowed out. Men did not fare much better. Kings produced heirs late, weak or not at all. Some were impotent, some were sterile. These issues were discussed in whispers. Blame shifted strategically. Advisors argued. Factions formed. A marriage's failure could destabilize an entire kingdom. Despite all this, dynasties persisted in repeating the same choices. Familial alliances felt safe. New blood felt risky. The long-term consequences were invisible compared to the short-term political gains. And medieval rulers were famously bad at long-term thinking. In some cases, the results were almost tragic in their predictability. A child born after generations of close marriage would be weak from birth, constantly ill, developmentally delayed. The court rallied around them. Tutors adjusted expectations. The succession plan grew fragile. Everyone hoped for improvement that never came. These children grew into adults who could not rule effectively. Some were kind but incapable. Others were volatile, paranoid, or withdrawn. Power flowed around them, not through them. Regents governed. Courtiers schemed. The monarch became a symbol rather than a ruler, trapped by their own bloodline. Royal marriages were also emotionally bleak. Couples raised apart met as strangers bound by duty. Affections sometimes grew, but often did not. Language barriers were common. A bride might arrive speaking none of the local tongue. Loneliness followed quickly. Letters home became lifelines. Some queens never adjusted. Some never stopped being foreign. When discussed at all, was treated as an obligation. Consummation was a public concern. Witnesses were sometimes involved. Beds were inspected. Sheets examined. Privacy was minimal. Romance was not part of the process. Efficiency was. And yet, despite the misery, these marriages were celebrated lavishly. Feasts, pageantry, symbolism. The contrast between the spectacle and the reality was striking. Beneath the silk and gold were two young people facing a lifetime of expectation, pressure, and genetic uncertainty. When marriages failed politically, the consequences were swift. Alliances collapsed, wars followed, queens were blamed, kings remarried, children were sidelined. History moved on with little regard for personal cost. So as we drift through these unions, it's worth remembering how preventable much of it was. A wider gene pool, a pause for reflection, a single generation choosing differently. But medieval power structures did not reward restraint, they rewarded continuity, even when continuity was slowly destroying itself. These marriages shaped Europe, borders, dynasties, wars. They also shaped bodies and minds in quieter ways. The tremor in a hand, the weakness in a lung, the confusion behind a crown. As you rest now, let these unions fade softly into the background. The vows spoken too early, the children expected too soon, the bloodlines narrowing with every well-intentioned mistake. And when you're ready, we'll drift onward again, toward monarchs who inherited all of this and responded poorly.
If you're still awake, welcome back once more. And if you're not, then this is simply background noise, which is exactly what medieval monarchs would have wanted while making deeply questionable decisions. Tonight, we drift gently into the personalities that emerged from all that careful inbreeding, emotional neglect, and ceremonial childhoods. Kings and queens who were, by any reasonable standard, difficult people. Not terrifying monsters, just exhausting, petty, and profoundly unprepared for adulthood. Power in the medieval world did not select for maturity, it selected for birth order, and so many rulers arrived on the throne already irritated, suspicious, and convinced of their own importance. From the moment they were crowned, they expected obedience without explanation. When they did not receive it, they sulked, or punished, or both. Some monarchs developed elaborate grudges over minor slights, a noble arriving late, a servant misplacing a glove, a relative using the wrong title. These offenses were remembered for years, sometimes decades. Revenge was slow, ceremonial, and entirely disproportionate. Naturally, everyone pretended it was justice. There were kings who refused to speak to their wives for years over perceived disrespect, queens who isolated courtiers they disliked into administrative exile, monarchs who cancelled councils because they were bored or tired or slightly unwell. Governance was flexible when emotions were involved. Many rulers were deeply insecure. Raised without affection and surrounded by flattery, they learned early that praise was unreliable and criticism was dangerous. This produced paranoia. Advisors were watched closely, friends were tested repeatedly, loyalty was demanded constantly, then doubted immediately after it was given. Some monarchs coped with micromanaging everything. They involved themselves in the smallest details of court life, seating arrangements, clothing choices, who stood where during ceremonies. This gave them a sense of control. It also drove everyone around them quietly mad. Others went the opposite direction and withdrew entirely. They avoided meetings, delegated endlessly, let favorites rule in their place. These favorites often abused their power, which the monarch ignored until it became embarrassing. At that point, they were shocked, genuinely shocked. History is full of rulers surprised by outcomes they personally enabled. Pettiness often extended into international affairs. Kings insulted each other through letters carefully crafted to sound polite while being devastating. Queens refused diplomatic gifts because they were the wrong color. Wars were started over claims that might generously be described as thin. There were kings who obsessed over etiquette to an unhealthy degree. A misplaced bow, a chair positioned slightly too low, these things mattered deeply. They were symbols of respect, and respect was the only currency that truly mattered at court. Losing face was worse than losing money, sometimes worse than losing territory. Some monarchs developed odd habits, refusing to bathe, bathing excessively, eating only specific foods prepared in precise ways, insisting on sleeping at certain times. These habits were indulged because no one wanted to argue. Over time, indulgence became routine. Routine became dysfunction. Mental illness was present and poorly understood. Depression, anxiety, paranoia, and psychosis appeared regularly in royal families. These were explained away as melancholy, divine punishment, or simply temperament. Treatment ranged from prayer to isolation. Occasionally, the solution was to lock the monarch away and rule around them. Anger was common. Violent outbursts were tolerated if they did not disrupt the succession. Servants bore the brunt of this, so did advisors. Punishments could be sudden and severe. Executions happened swiftly. Regret, if it came at all, came much later. Some queens expressed their pettiness more quietly, through social exclusion, through strategic silence, through carefully timed displays of affection or coldness. Court life was a long game of emotional chess, and many queens were excellent at it. Survival required subtlety. Royal marriages suffered under these personalities. Spouses avoided each other. Affairs flourished. Children observed everything. The cycle continued. A petty king raised a suspicious heir. A controlling queen raised an anxious daughter. Patterns repeated with remarkable consistency. And yet, despite their flaws, many of these monarchs ruled for decades. Their kingdoms functioned, administrations adapted, people learned to work around moods and tempers. The machinery of state was surprisingly resilient, even when operated by someone who should not have been trusted with a village council.
Some rulers mellowed with age. Others grew worse. Power, once secured, removed the last incentive for self-reflection. Advisors learned when to agree and when to disappear. History recorded the results with polite phrasing and strategic omissions. What remains striking is how small many of these conflicts were at their core. Hurt feelings, bruised egos, childhood insecurities amplified by absolute authority. Entire regions suffered because someone felt ignored. As you rest now, imagine the quiet chambers of these rulers late at night, the crown set aside, the court silent, a king replaying an insult from years ago, a queen brooding over a perceived betrayal. Power does not soothe these thoughts, it gives them room to echo. Let these figures fade gently into the background, their grievances dissolving into the soft hum of time. And when you're ready, we'll drift onward again toward the most extreme results of all this careful mismanagement. If you're still here, drifting softly through the corridors of history, welcome back. If you've dozed off, that is, as always, entirely acceptable. Tonight we reach the inevitable conclusion of our gentle wander through medieval royalty, the long, slow unraveling of dynasties under the pressure of inbreeding, fragile bloodlines, and centuries of narrow marriages. Nothing dramatic, no battles, no proclamations,
just the quiet, relentless passage of heredity and misfortune. Medieval rulers valued familiarity in marriage above all else. Cousins, uncles, nieces, distant aunts, all were fair game. Each generation reinforced patterns, sometimes deliberately, sometimes by habit. Genetics, unknown and mysterious, was ignored in favor of politics. The results appeared gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. A jaw slightly pronounced, a tendency toward weakness, a cough that never left. Then, as decades passed, the effects compounded. Bloodlines narrowed, fragility multiplied. Children were born sickly, malformed, or mentally impaired. These outcomes were quietly managed. Portraits softened features. Advisors whispered euphemisms. Courts adapted. A kingdom did not collapse immediately because a king had a pronounced jaw or a queen could not produce children reliably. But the strain grew generation after generation, like water wearing away stone. In Spain and Austria, the Habsburgs exemplified this pattern. Jawlines became exaggerated, fertility declined, epilepsy and other disorders emerged predictably. Some monarchs survived long enough to rule, but their health, temperament, and judgment were often compromised. Their reigns were defined by the limits of their own bodies, not by the expansiveness of their ambition. Elsewhere, fragile heirs created crises. Thrones passed to children who could barely stand under the weight of expectation. Regency councils managed the state for decades at a time, while the king or queen remained a symbolic figure. They were dressed in silks, crowned, celebrated, but their power was nominal, their influence muted, their health precarious. The court adapted, but the long-term consequences were inexorable. Genetic misfortune did not respect borders. England, France, Portugal, and Spain all experienced children born into fragile bodies, weak minds, or compromised immunity. Alliances meant to strengthen kingdoms instead produced rulers who struggled simply to survive. Wars were fought, treaties negotiated, and yet the underlying human frailty remained. Monarchs might conquer lands or hold councils, but their bodies and bloodlines betrayed them quietly. Sometimes the consequences were subtle, slight delays in succession, unexpected deaths, or heirs who could not bear children. Other times the results were more striking, repeated miscarriages, children born with severe disabilities, or rulers incapable of meaningful governance. Courtiers learned to adapt, to protect the dynasty from its own biology. Advisors who anticipated weak heirs became indispensable, while those who didn't were quietly sidelined or replaced. Inbreeding amplified minor quirks into unmistakable traits. Physical deformities, cognitive limitations, and predispositions to illness were magnified. Generations of close-kin marriage produced rulers whose oddities were obvious to observers, even as the families themselves remained blind, hopeful, and ritualistically optimistic. They married cousins again and again, always seeking political advantage, always repeating the same mistakes. And yet, despite all these limitations, dynasties endured. The machinery of monarchy was resilient. Governments adapted to fragile heirs. Regencies, councils, and careful planning allowed kingdoms to function. History often describes medieval rulers as larger than life, but the reality was a slow, quiet negotiation with biology itself. Power could not erase frailty, it could only disguise it. It's oddly comforting, in a way, to consider this, that even the most powerful people were constrained by human vulnerability, that all their wealth, all their ceremonies, all their advisors could not prevent the natural outcomes of repeated mistakes. They dressed their children in silk, painted smiles on their portraits, and hoped. But genetics marched forward quietly, insistently, beyond their control. So, as you lie there now, let these fragile dynasties drift through your mind. The tiny heirs with fragile bones, the children raised by distant nurses, the kings with overpronounced jaws, the queens burdened with too many pregnancies. Let the endless repetition of these quiet failures soothe you, because there is no rush, no climax, no sudden shock, just the gentle, inexorable rhythm of time. History is not always about conquest or glory or battle. Sometimes it's about children who could not survive, marriages that went wrong for reasons no one understood, and dynasties held together by hope, ritual, and the faintest thread of human resilience. That is the medieval world in its quietest, saddest, most human form. So settle in, close your eyes, imagine the echo of distant halls, soft candlelight flickering over portraits of yawning kings and melancholy queens, the quiet footsteps of nurses through drafty corridors, and the slow, patient passage of generations. And drift gently into the soft, persistent lull of history itself.